Hi, everyone. We are back with our first session of the day. It's entitled Lake Restoration, and we have 3 speakers. The first 2 will be pre-recorded, and the third one will be a live presentation. We will have a question and answer after the first presenter, and then the next 2 will happen consecutively with a question and answer at the end for both presenters. So our first one today is Rob Zisette from Herrera Environmental. Rob?
Consultants, I'd like to thank you all for coming to the WALPA 2020 virtual conference. Those lakes are Anderson Lake and Lone Lake. Anderson Lake is located in Jefferson County, just south of Port Townsend, shown on this Google Earth map to the west. And east of that, on the same latitude, is Lone Lake on Whidbey Island, just east of Coopville. Further to the east Everett, and further to the east is Storm Lake. You may wonder why Storm Lake. Well, that's because that's now my lake. I just bought a house on Storm Lake, and I thought you might want to know where that is. All on the same latitude. So both projects were funded by Washington State Department of Ecology. Thank you very much. With the Algae Grant Program, it's a fabulous program we're lucky to have here in Washington. Jefferson County Public Health administered the Anderson Lake Algae Management Plan, while Whidbey Island Conservation District administered the Lone Lake Algae Management Plan. We had a 1-year monitoring period for the diagnostic study to collect all the nutrient inputs and water inputs to do our water and phosphorus budget and characterize conditions in each of the lakes, beginning in March of 2019 and ending in February of 2020, and producing the plans or reports in June of 2020. Here are the watersheds on different scales, because Lone Lake is 4 times larger than Anderson Lake. Anderson Lake watershed is under 600 acres, very small, located 100% in the Anderson Lake State Park. But both watersheds are dominated by forest cover, with the addition of low-density residential and some farmland development or land use in the Lone Lake watershed. The Lone Lake watershed is drains from the north principally into 2 main tributaries that drain to the north shore of Lone Lake, whereas Anderson Lake is fed by much smaller intermittent tributaries, primarily along the west shore. Both lakes drain to the south outlet channel. Here's the bathymetry maps of each lake. Anderson Lake's about 2/3 the size of Lone Lake, which is about 100 acres. However, the volumes are similar because Anderson Lake is deeper. Anderson Lake is a maximum depth of 9 meters, almost twice that of the 5-meter depth in Lone Lake. Thermal structure is different because of this different morphology. In fact, Anderson Lake is monomictic. It's deep enough to stratify. In the summer, shown in the upper left isopleth of temperature. The stratification is a rather thick metallinean rather than a narrow thermocline, whereas the Lone Lake is polymictic. You can see from the vertical temperature profiles in the upper right that it never stratified at all in 2019. Oxygen, however, is also very different because of the stratification in Anderson Lake. Oxygen is lost below the thermocline and all summer long. It was anoxic below a depth of 15 feet from June through September. Whereas Lone Lake did see some oxygen depression, I would say, during the summer, but it never really reached a level of anoxia except for one bottom sample on one sampling date in July. Trophic state, Lone Lake takes the cake there at 68 as an average index approaching hypereutrophy. But they're both eutrophic lakes. They do also have the similar pattern of increasing trophic state index from Secchi transparency to chlorophyll algae biomass up to the highest index for total phosphorus, indicating that phosphorus is in abundant supply, more so than would be expected for the amount of algae in the lakes. It turns out phosphorus is the limiting nutrient primarily in Anderson Lake, although both nutrients can appear to have been limiting through part of the summer, whereas Lone Lake was almost exclusively limited by nitrogen during the summer, I should say, during the summer algae growing season. Here's the cyanotoxins. This is why we're here. Anotoxin A is clearly the problem child here. It comparison to the 1 microgram per liter guideline. It's as you may know, it's a neurotoxin and has a very low concentration tolerance for humans and mammals that consume it. In fact, a dog died in Anderson Lake during our study year, and you can maybe see why. The concentrations of anotoxin A in Anderson Lake exceed 100 times on average this guideline, but so did Lone Lake, and even had a higher maximum, at least among the last 4 years that we compiled data here in this table. But microcystin is present in both lakes, didn't exceed the guideline in Anderson Lake in 2019, but has the past 3 out of 4 years in Lone Lake, but at lower levels, obviously, in comparison to anotoxin A. The major toxin producer is Delicospermum, and in both lakes, it's been well documented by Theo Dreyer, who you should see his presentation later on, in Anderson Lake. Microcystis, though, is also present and abundant and dominant at times in Lone Lake and responsible for the microcystin production there, apparently. The causes are different. Anderson Lake has clearly had a toxic algae problem for a long time. And in fact, it's Will Hobbs's paleolimnological study that he presented at WALPA last year, showing that cyanobacteria have been present in that lake for over a century and really kicked off in high gear based on pigment analysis in the mid-1900s, when, coincidentally, cattle were grazing in that watershed. They have since declined, but are obviously clearly at high levels. So you can imagine how high they were in the mid-1900s when they were pigment analysis in the sediments, at any rate, were hundreds of times that we are today. But moving over to Lone Lake is a more recent phenomenon. In fact, just over 10 years ago has been the problem. Anotoxin was first detected in 2010, microcystin a few years before that. It's really was primarily, in my opinion, initiated from the grass carp plant in 2007. Unfortunately, Lone Lake used to be the best fishing lake in Washington, healthy aquatic plant community, until Egeria densa invaded that plant in the early 2000s. And following that, with herbicide treatment that didn't work to the grass carp, the plants have since been lost entirely in that lake. They're coming back, but the grass carp took them out. Moving forward is the water budget. So a lot of work went into this water budget, a lot of monitoring flows and rainfall, and you see it is rainfall. It's a direct precip. It's out of the sky where these lakes get most of their water. Stormwater runoff is small. They're very pervious, undeveloped forested soils, therefore not generating a lot of runoff. The retention time is about 2 years in Lone Lake and 3 times longer than that in Anderson Lake because of its smaller basin. Most of the lake is lost by evaporation and not much out the outlet stream. However, on the balance, it's really going out by groundwater. So we see this negative groundwater input at the bottom of about 100% in both lakes during the summer because those lakes levels dropped, as that's what the negative input minus you can see the lake storage change decreased in the summer, and the outlets dried up, and the water exited the lake through the soils, wetland soils, and out to the south of the lake through the ground. The phosphorus budget has a very different picture. Despite all that water coming in from the sky, not much phosphorus is, less than 5% in both lakes on an annual or summer basis. Very limited base flow and very small amount of stormwater runoff. Similarly, there is some groundwater inputs on an annual basis, which are reasonable, but not in the summer. So it's in the summer where you're getting this sediment phosphorus release. All the sediment phosphorus release is occurring in the summer. We calculated several ways. The average shown here showed 97% of the phosphorus input to the lake during the summer came from sediment release of phosphorus, and 83%, not quite as much, in Lone Lake. As a result, the clearly shows this high internal phosphorus loading is from a legacy of input from the watershed that would necessarily require in-lake management to reduce the phosphorus and hence the algal biomass to meet water quality goals. So here are algae management objectives we developed for Lone Lake. They're similar to the ones we developed for Anderson Lake, but those aren't shown here because they were removed from the report. Seattle. The Washington State Parks, which owns the Anderson Lake, and decided that they didn't want to manage algae or cyanobacteria blooms in the lake because it's a natural phenomena, as shown by wills. They've been growing in the lake for over a century. And their policy, the state parks, is to not manage natural phenomena. Therefore, we turned it into a water quality report and not any management objectives. So let's proceed with Lone Lake, which was very similar to what we'd originally proposed for Anderson Lake with some nuances. But at any rate, Lone Lake here, these objectives were to reduce the trophic status from eutrophic to mesotrophic with these summer average thresholds presented here, which would require a phosphorus reduction load overall of 90% in the summer to achieve an average phosphorus concentration of 24 micrograms per liter in the lake. This would necessarily reduce toxic algae blooms, the amount of algae and the toxins produced by them. This is intended to take this shift by reducing the nutrient loading in this graphic to the left to reducing algal biomass down from the top and providing a more healthier aquatic plant community and moving the lake from its current turbid cyanobacteria dominated state to its previous clear water aquatic plant community state. These are the feasible management options, in-lake management options. I don't have time to show the infeasible ones or the management, the watershed management ones, but looking at a couple of options for phosphorus inactivation, some mixing either by aeration or the newer nanobubble technology or the solar beam, along with algae sonic, another newer treatment device that restricts algal cyanobacteria migration and cell formation, but along with the traditional algicides. Our recommendation was to further evaluate a no-action alternative versus 3 of the treatment alternatives, including alum, nanobubblers, and algae sonic. The community elected to go with the no-action alternative, principally because they don't have funds for a technological management solution, but to continue also to conduct water quality monitoring to see if, in fact, the lake is continuing to improve in water quality as the citizens are removing grass carp with their bow and arrow and as they die off with age, but to also assess the watershed nutrients from either manure applications and fertilizer applications and septic sources control. And with that, I have plenty of time for questions, so thank you.
Hi. Please send your questions in. We haven't seen any yet, but I do have one. And Rob, I'm wondering about the state's assessment of the condition of Anderson Lake as being natural. Wouldn't you consider that what Will found before the cattle farming would actually be the natural state? So I'm wondering what the basis was for that decision, or if you know.
Well, it's their decision. But I will say I didn't show the graph, Will's graph, which is high level. The current levels of pigments in the sediment, in the recent sediments near the surface, are at the same as they were before the cattle. So the cattle was a blip. So it's arguable that it's back to natural conditions today, I guess.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. The other thing would be, lost my train of thought. Sorry. Anyway, so if you have further questions for Rob, please do send them to info@walpa.org. We've been finding that there's sometimes a lag between when you send it and when we get it. If you will put the session name or number and the presenter along with your question, we can direct them to the presenters and they can respond to you. So we're going to move on to our next talk, and that will be Shannon Brattebo, and she is with Tetra Tech. She is giving the first of 2 consecutive talks about a tale of 2 lakes. So Shannon, you want to unmute and put on your picture, and we will run your presentation. Thanks.
I'm an environmental engineer with Tetra Tech, and I'm going to talk about a project that we just finished with Snohomish County, looking at the nutrient dynamics of 2 small lakes. And we did this using a cost-effective approach. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Harry Gibbons with Tetra Tech, and Marisa Burghdoff, Jen Oden, and Katie Ruthenberg with Snohomish County Surface Water Management. Little bit of background. We looked at the nutrient dynamics of 2 small residential lakes located in Snohomish County. Both of these lakes have a history of toxic algae blooms. Sunday Lake, which is the lake located in the top upper right corner of your slide, is 49 acres in size and has a maximum depth of 6.1 meters. The lake stratifies very strongly in the summertime, starting usually around April or May and going until October. The same happens at Lake Loma, very strong stratification in the summer. Lake Loma is slightly smaller than Sunday at only 23 acres, but has a slightly deeper maximum depth of 8.5 meters. Lake Loma is shown in the picture in the lower left-hand corner of your slide. Both lakes have very active and concerned groups of lake residents who wanted to do something about the declining water quality of each lake. Snohomish County obtained funding from the Washington Department of Ecology Freshwater Algae Program to develop algae control plans for both of these lakes. And I'm going to be talking about the nutrient component and understanding the nutrient dynamics of each of these lakes, which went into the development of the algae control plans. This graph just gives you a little bit of background in terms of summer average total phosphorus for Sunday Lake and Lake Loma. This graph shows the long-term average of epilumnetic summer total phosphorus. You can see that Sunday Lake has a long-term average of around 39 micrograms per liter, and Lake Loma is not far behind with an average long-term average of summer epilumnetic TP of 33 micrograms per liter. Both of these lakes are pretty productive systems. This graph shows you a summary of average hypolumnetic phosphorus for each lake compared to other lakes within Snohomish County. Both lakes have high average hypolumnetic TP during the summer and experience a buildup that occurs throughout the summer. which is indicative of internal loading or the release of phosphorus from the sediments under anoxic conditions. As I mentioned, both of these lakes stratify very strongly, and once stratification sets up in early spring, the dissolved oxygen at the bottom of these lakes almost instantaneously goes to zero and remains at zero or very low throughout the entire summer. So the project goals. The overall goal of the project was to identify the most suitable strategies for reducing phosphorus and subsequent toxic algae blooms in each of these lakes. We developed algae control plans for each of the lakes, and the goals for each of those plans were to determine the major sources and magnitude of phosphorus loading to each of the lakes, was to determine the best alternatives that could be implemented to reduce that phosphorus loading, and then to work with the lake community to determine what their preferred alternative strategy would be. The focus of this talk is centered on that first goal of each of the plans, which was to determine and estimate the major sources and amounts of phosphorus loading to each of the lakes. Our project approach was maybe slightly different than we had used in the past. It used more of a cost-effective approach and relied on a combination of historic data, recent water quality and sediment studies, and did not include a full hydrologic model, nutrient budget, or mass balance model. The funds just were not available for that type of project. And the costs for doing a full hydrologic budget and detailed study were potentially greater than most of the restoration options for these small lakes. So we determined that we could accept a higher degree of uncertainty in our findings of our study in order to develop a more practical plan to proceed with lake restoration for Sunday and Lake Loma. So I'm going to be focused on talking about the nutrient dynamics and how we analyzed and estimated the loadings to each of these lakes. And this is just a simple graphic showing the different components of the phosphorus loading to each of these lakes. So we have phosphorus loading from surface runoff from the watershed. We have loading from direct precipitation onto the lake surface. We have loading from groundwater, which was the most challenging to determine. We have internal loading from the lake sediments, and we also have loading from waterfowl, which turned out to be a significant contributor, especially in Sunday Lake. So first, let's start with looking at the phosphorus load from direct precipitation onto the lake surfaces. So we used the same rain gauge data for both lakes, and that was data from a gauge at Lake Crabapple, which is actually the downstream lake from Lake Loma. And this graph shows you annual total rainfall from 2008 to 2018, with a 10-year average of just over 38 inches of rain. Most of that rainfall occurs between October and April, with a minimum amount of precipitation during the summer months. We assumed a phosphorus concentration in the rainwater of 24 micrograms per liter, and that was based on an ecology study done in 2013 for Lake Loma. And so using an average of 38 inches a year of rain and the 24 micrograms per liter of phosphorus, we determined that direct precipitation contributes just over 2 kilograms of phosphorus per year to Lake Loma and about 4.5 kilograms of phosphorus a year to Sunday Lake. So the surface water runoff, or the external loading of phosphorus from the watershed, was very challenging to estimate, given that we did not have detailed information on the hydrologic inputs and outflows of each lake, and we had very limited data on phosphorus concentrations within the seasonal ditches and creeks and inlets to the lake. So we estimated external loading based on land use classifications and phosphorus runoff coefficients for each land use. The map here on your screen shows you the land use classifications within the Sunday Lake watershed, and most of it is light urban residential with some forest and pasture lands and a little bit of light rural residential. And of course, we have the streets or transportation land use as well. And we know that the majority of inflow to these lakes occurs between mid-November and early April, which is typical for lakes in this region. So most of this external load from the surface watershed is going to occur during those months. Now, the way that we did this using land use and runoff coefficients does not include any phosphorus loading from groundwater or on-site septic systems within the watershed. So this slide just gives you the results of this external loading exercise that we did. And the surface water runoff into Lake Loma contributes about 16 kilograms of phosphorus per year, most of that coming from light urban residential land uses. And for Sunday Lake, it contributes about 64 kilograms of phosphorus per year. Again, most of that coming from light urban residential with some forested and light rural residential contributions. Now, the timing of this surface runoff and loading and external load is very important. Most of this occurs during the fall, winter, and early spring months because only 14% of the precipitation falls during the summer. So this loading is coming into the lake during the winter, and most likely some of it is leaving the lake with increased outflows, but some of it is also being retained. Groundwater. Groundwater was the major unknown for both of these lakes and contributes the most uncertainty to our analysis. We know based on observations and historical information that groundwater is an important part hydrologically to Lake Loma, but not so much to Sunday Lake. So we really kind of dug into the archives at Snohomish County looking for previous studies or any kind of information that we could get to help us determine groundwater inputs into Lake Loma. We discovered 2 studies that were very helpful. The 7 Lakes Water Quality Analysis and Management Plan done in 1986 by Entrenco calculated a groundwater load to Lake Loma and had a full hydrologic budget, which was helpful to look at. And then there was a phosphorus screening level assessment done for Lake Loma by the Department of Ecology in 2013. The ecology study calculated the phosphorus load to groundwater and ultimately to the lake from on-site septic systems within the watershed. So we use that same approach to then calculate a groundwater load from septic systems from around Sunday Lake as well. So as I mentioned, the 7 Lake study for Lake Loma had a much more robust data set for us to kind of dive into, and it included some shallow groundwater well monitoring, and they estimated a groundwater load to Lake Loma at 6 kilograms per year. The ecology study that actually calculated load from on-site septic systems using a per capita loading rate and failure rates, they estimated the groundwater load to Lake Loma at 27 kilograms per year. So that gave us a nice range to use in our analysis. And then using the same method that ecology did for Lake Loma, we estimated the load to groundwater from on-site septic systems at about 9 kilograms per year for Sunday Lake. Now we know most of this groundwater loading is most likely going to occur during the fall, winter, and spring months when the soils are saturated. And we do have a very limited amount of lake level data for these lakes that show us that the lake level declines throughout the summer, which is indicative of very limited to no inflow from groundwater in the summer months. We looked at the internal loading of that occurs in both of these lakes because we do know that the hypolimnion goes anoxic and that there is a release of phosphorus from the sediments. So we used 2 methods to calculate the sediment release rate, or the SRR. The first method looked at the increase in hypolimnetic total phosphorus concentrations during the time when the lakes were stratified. And the 2 graphs at the bottom of the slide show this dramatic increase in both total phosphorus and soluble phosphorus throughout the summer, which is indicative of internal loading. We also then looked at established relationships between sediment mobile phosphorus concentrations in the actual sediments and phosphorus release rates. And we had multiple years of data for Sunday Lake that we used to calculate a range of sediment release rates. So this graph here shows you Lake Loma sediment phosphorus concentrations, which are the blue lines, compared to other lakes within Washington. And we were surprised to see that Lake Loma has a significant amount of total phosphorus in its sediments, more so than what we saw at Lake Ketchum, which is the gray line. And as we dug into the data that was available to us, we found out that past management practices have contributed to this very high amount of phosphorus in the sediments. This is a table that we found that summarizes the types and quantities of fertilizers that were used in Lake Loma during the 1950s. So no doubt contributing to that high amount of phosphorus in the bottom sediments. This graph shows you total phosphorus in Sunday Lake sediments, which is that bright blue line. And it ended up being actually higher than what we saw at Lake Loma, which is the orange line. And again, we then started digging into some of the history and discovered that the historical practices and management and uses of the lake, including logging and there have been accounts of cedar shavings from the logs settling and being deposited onto the lake bottom at Sunday Lake, are most likely contributing to these high phosphorus concentrations in the bottom sediments. So this slide has a lot of numbers on it, but what we were able to do was calculate sediment release rates from both looking at the increase in phosphorus in the hypolimnion, which is method 1 for both lakes. And then we also looked at the relationship with sediment mobile phosphorus. And we were able to get good agreement between the two methods. And so we used the average sediment release rate and the hypolimnetic surface area to calculate a total phosphorus release from the anoxic sediments. We also assumed that there was some aerobic release of phosphorus, and we assumed that was 10% of the sediment release rate for the anoxic sediments. So we applied that aerobic phosphorus release rate to the epilimnetic sediments and came up with a total amount of internal loading for each lake. So just over 18 kilograms of phosphorus per year for Lake Loma and about 115 kilograms of phosphorus per year for Sunday Lake. So a large amount of phosphorus. So one interesting and surprising source of phosphorus for these lakes, for Sunday Lake in particular, was waterfowl. The waterfowl loading for Lake Loma was very small. We have some counts of waterfowl from volunteer monitors, but the counts were very low. However, for Sunday Lake supports a very large population of overwintering trumpeter swans, snow geese, and ducks. And the main overwintering time is November to March. And Snohomish County had volunteers out for a whole season counting the waterfowl on the lake. And it ended up being that there were 21 geese, 51 ducks, and 320 swans that utilized Sunday Lake each day on average. So that ended up contributing 350 kilograms of phosphorus a year to Sunday Lake, most of it in the winter time, November to March. And we assume that some of that leaves the lake through the outlet, but a large portion probably settles to the lake bottom, enriches the sediments, and then is recycled back into the water column. Swans and snow geese are expanding in the area and have already started to increase their overwintering populations at nearby Lake Armstrong. So is this due to climate changes? Is there a management solution to this? We're not sure what to do about this large source of phosphorus, that there really doesn't seem like there's a lot of options in terms of management solutions. So this slide shows you the summary of the nutrient loadings for phosphorus for each lake. With Lake Loma, because we had those two, a high and a low groundwater estimate, using the low groundwater estimate, we have about 43 kilograms of phosphorus a year going into Lake Loma. The high estimate bumps that up to 64 kilograms per year. And for Sunday Lake, waterfowl, 64% of the total annual load is coming from waterfowl. And so that's a huge, huge portion of that annual budget. With these groundwater estimates, the uncertainty doesn't really change how we calculate and cost out the alternatives, but it does change how effective those restoration alternatives will be in the long run and how long they will last. So for both of these lakes, internal loading is a large contributor both annually, but more importantly, it's a very significant part during the summer load. 70 to 85% of the summer load to these two lakes is coming from internal loading and the bottom sediments. So in conclusion, we were able to use this cost-effective approach to understand the nutrient dynamics in each lake and the sources of phosphorus that are most likely contributing to the growth of toxic algae in these two lakes. We have some certainty. There's a little bit of uncertainty, but really it's not going to impact the management alternatives that we look at. We were able to save the county and the lake residents money that could then be used towards implementation. You know, if the county had opted to spend $150,000 on each lake to do a more detailed study, would we have reached a different outcome and conclusions? Would the recommended alternative be different? Probably not. It could be, but most likely it would end up being the same. So stay tuned for part 2. Marisa is going to talk about how we use the understanding of the nutrient dynamics of each lake to help meet our project goals in identifying restoration alternatives, and how the county worked with each community to then choose a path forward. Thank you.
Actually, with that, I think that we're going to have you hold questions, Shannon, and we are going to go directly to Marisa's talk. We have been finding out, because this is a learning process, that there is a lag time between when you type your questions and send them to info@walpa.org and when we receive them here in the Zoom chat room. So if you still have questions for Rob, please send them in, and we're going to collate questions for all 3 presenters and do a comprehensive Q&A at the end. So thanks for your consideration on this, and take it away, Marisa.
Good morning. I'm Marisa Burghdoff from Snohomish County Surface Water Management, and I'll presenting the second half, which I swear we did not come up with this title after we saw Rob's. We independently came up with the Tale of Two Lakes. So as Shannon said, if we could start the presentation then, going to the next slide. We are talking about Loma and Sunday Lakes, which are 2 small lakes that are mostly in rural settings with a lot of people that live right on the shoreline. So next. And they both have lots of toxic algae and really high amounts of phosphorus is their big common factor. And next. And the most important thing here is they have residents that are really committed to their lake. They've lived there, many of them for years, or are new to it, and they see a system that's not healthy. They're concerned about their children and their grandchildren being able to use the lake safely. And they've come to us, and for these are the reasons that we are developing these algae control plans are for the residents. So next. And the 3 major steps to doing that is to determine the major sources of pollution, which we just found out about. And I'm going to be really focusing on how we identify those best solutions and then working with the community to select the alternatives. Next. I'm just going to kind of skip over this one. We just heard the sources, so you can go ahead to the next one. We're really going to be talking about finding the solution. And when we talk about finding the solution, there's 3 main components that you'll see on the next slide, which is it effective? Is it affordable? And is it embraced by the community? Because if it doesn't have any one of these components, it will not be implemented at these lakes. So we're going to dive more closely into the effective on the next slide, what does that mean? So our goals were to have lower total phosphorus concentrations. In these lakes, this is what drives the algae bloom, and less than 20 micrograms per liter would be ideal based on the ecology's action values for this region. Most importantly, we want less frequent toxic algae blooms. Ideally, we wouldn't have any. And when you fix those problems, you end up with higher dissolved oxygen concentrations and improved water clarity. And most importantly, you want it to be safe for aquatic life and lake recreation. So next. So we looked at several options. You heard some of these in Rob's presentation. The first is to directly try and control the algae. So there are options for algicides, physical inhibitors, such as ultrasonic devices and that sort of thing. But ultimately, these were rejected, which you'll see on you want to do the animation here. So rejected, and in our terms that were found not to be effective long-term. So this might be a good short-term solution, but if you kill off the algae, they'll basically decompose, release nutrients, and you'll end up with future algae blooms. They are embraced by the community, a lot of these, but like another lake community put in these sonic solutions, but it didn't work. So the next solution is to really look at phosphorus and controlling the underlying problem. So you can break out phosphorus into two components. The first is external. Next slide. Animation doesn't really work well in this, I'm realizing, and you can't control it. But in external phosphorus, we're really looking at the runoff and the groundwater. And for Sunday Lake, we're kind of lumping the waterfowl into external phosphorus as well. So if you go to the next slide. So external phosphorus control, where does it come from? And in these lake watersheds, if you want to push the animation, we're really finding it's coming from people. In these watersheds, it's just residents living around the lake, and the little actions they do from many little sources add up to be a big problem for the lake. So when we look at solutions, if you click on the animation, it's outreach. So outreach is really the only way to encourage behavior change to solve these problems. And in Snohomish County, we have a program called Lakewise, which you'll see is our logo on the next slide here. And Lakewise started in 2012 for just this problem, and it's across the county working with lake residents. At the Coauthors program, the next slide, you'll see that it's Lake Certification Program. This is where landowners who make small changes on their property to prevent pollution are recognized with a Lakewise certified sign. It's completely voluntary. It's open to shoreline and upland landowners within lake watersheds. So you can go to the next slide. It starts with a site visit with our watershed steward. These are free site visits, and again, it's voluntary. On the next slide. They go over a checklist, so they answer any questions about their property, give them ideas on how to best implement the checklist, and if landowners decide to do it, they get a Lakewise certified sign. Next slide. It also includes educational workshops and rebates. We give workshops on lawn and septic care. This is the main reason or how people get involved in the program, and this is really where they learn about those best management practices for septics and lawns. And next slide. We have Healthy Shores. We offer technical help for shoreline restoration, as well as free native plants. And if you go to the next slide, you can see an example of a before and after restoration project. So this is a super quick summary of our Lakewise program. If you go to the next slide, we've had high success. So first at Sunday Lake, you can see the statistics here when the box shows up. We've had basically 1 in 4 households at Sunday Lake across the watershed involved, and on the lake shoreline in particular, 1 in 3 households have been involved, and they've restored 550 feet of shoreline. Loma is similar, about 30 or 1 in 3 households have participated in the program, and even more shoreline restoration there. So overall, this was accepted as a restoration solution, is effective, embraced by the community, and it's affordable because the county is already paying for it across the county. Okay, next slide. But this doesn't get at the whole problem, especially at Lake Loma. We found from Shannon's presentation that groundwater could be a potential big contributor to this system, particularly from septic systems. So we wanted to see if there's anything else we can do to encourage changes and improvements in septic systems. So we looked at several options. The first one is on the next slide about showing sewers. Or this is what every resident asked for. Well, can't we just put a sewer in? And it's been a pipe dream since the 70s, and that study that Shannon referred to in '86 was actually to assess the ability to put in a sewer system, not just for Lake Loma, but the 7 area lakes in this region. They found that it was extremely expensive, and in most cases, septic systems were not significant pollution contributors, with the Loma Lake being one of the higher ones that had groundwater value. So the cost versus benefit wasn't there, so this was rejected basically on the cost. The next solution that we looked at was septic retrofits. So this is where you take an old system, you add some newer technology such as media filters or other things to polish and remove phosphorus. But this was also rejected because it was not affordable. So this was thousands of dollars for each system to add this technology. It might be a good option when there's no other ability to help septic systems on an individual basis, but overall was rejected. The last idea we looked at was a septic savings program. Now, this was an idea that came from a different lake, Lake Rossiger, that had had a previous study done to help protect the lake. And basically it was worked out with a water provider that each month, depending on how much water you used, they would charge you a small amount that kind of went into a savings account for your septic inspection. And so when you had enough water usage, then you would get a notice that you're due for an inspection, and you would then, it would already be paid for. And so the whole goal is to increase the regularity of maintenance, and it affects every single resident, not just we were thinking at Lake Loma, but potentially all of those lakes in the area that could benefit from this program. So this was accepted for a recommendation because it would be effective, because everybody would have to participate, affordable because they're already paying for it. We weren't sure if it was being embraced by the community, but we did find the Loma residents thought this was a good idea. So the next issue was the swans, and Shannon already addressed this a little bit, but basically people like trumpeter swans don't want to get rid of them. They're protected. So there really was no good solution. If you want to click on the thing, for the next thing, actually one more, even though they had such a huge amount, there was no good solution. So we decided to treat this as internal loading rather than an external load that we could actually do something about. So just each year, whatever was left from the swans would become part of the problem that had to be dealt with as a legacy pollution source, which moves, we now need to look at internal phosphorus controls. So internal is that sediment piece, what comes up each summer, which was about 70 to 85% of the load in those summer months, and would need to be addressed for a long-term solution. So we looked at several options, starting with our first one here, which was dredging. This is what every landowner asked first. Can we just dredge a lake, especially shallow lakes? But because it's unlikely to get permitted, you would need additional treatment after dredging because they're still released from the underlying sediments, and it's extremely expensive on the scale of millions of dollars. This was rejected mostly from the cost aspect of it. So we looked at our next solution, which is aeration. So at Loma, in fact, the residents liked this solution so much that they went ahead and installed 3 aerators without getting any permits or approvals, which it was an admirable effort because their thought was, well, it would add oxygen to the water and help out the lake. Unfortunately, in both these systems, the sediment study shows there was simply not enough iron to bind with the phosphorus, even in the presence of oxygen, plus the systems were undersized. But because there's not enough iron, it actually just stirs up more and more lake sediments and would increase the phosphorus and associated algae blooms. So this on its own was rejected, mostly because of the effectiveness of it. And so next we looked at Fosslock. This is something I'm sure if you've heard of in other conferences. It binds phosphorus with minimal impacts to lake chemistry. However, for these 2 lake systems, there was a big question of efficacy because they had a very high humic acid and low alkalinity. And there's been some studies to suggest that it would not settle out as well in these systems and not be as effective. Plus, there isn't a good studies on long-term efficacy of this product yet. We're hoping to see more of that. And also based on the huge amount of sediment load in these systems, it looked like it would be a higher cost for equivalent dose than a comparable alternative. So this was rejected, mostly on the questions of efficacy, but a little bit of affordability. The next solution is alum. Alum is, you heard about a little bit in Rob's talk, but basically it's aluminum sulfate is put into the system. It creates a flock that sinks and binds lake sediments permanently. There's a lot of research done, and it's been proven to be the most effective and appropriate method to bind sediment phosphorus. But you have to be careful. It's an acid, so you have to put it with a buffer to prevent changes in pH. And if it's not dosed and applied properly, it can affect aquatic life. So this solution was accepted because it was effective, embraced by the community, but there is some question of affordability. So next slide. The last solution we looked at was aeration with alum injection. So the residents were really, especially at Loma, interested in aeration. So if you combine aeration and inject alum, it can be really effective, as well as can be fine-tuned for it to be adaptively manage the lake. But it does require property, a place to create housing for the alum, and requires annual maintenance. So this solution was initially accepted as a recommendation to the community because of its effective. But there was some questions of affordability, and eventually the Lake Loma community at least rejected this option. Although at Sunday Lake, it became comparable to the alum treatments alone and went into the final recommendations. So how much alum do you really need? I'm not going to go into this a lot, but the dose was 41.3 milligrams of aluminum per liter at Loma. And I can't read that number, but you all can, 60 something milligrams at Sunday Lake. So this is a lot of alum. So the next question on our next slide is, how do we spread that out? So we don't want to, on such small systems, put all this alum in at once. So we recommended to the lake community that they have a large initial dose, so about half the total, and then spread the remaining doses throughout the year. And there were a lot of benefits because they would see an immediate improvement. It would allow for adaptive management, and you could also treat new inputs. So on the next slide, many of you are wondering how much this cost. You can see the first year for Loma, it'd be about $141,000, $35,000 afterwards. At Sunday Lake, it was $325,000 with about $90,000 afterwards. And this includes all the monitoring and permitting that goes along with that. So this was disappointing. This was extremely expensive, especially for Sunday Lake, and difficult for when you look at the per cost of parcel basis. So the next slide, we ultimately ended our plans with the 3 recommendations of Lakewise, the septic savings program at Loma, and alum treatments or alum injection with aeration. Although Sunday Lake, we initially said to take basically a no action approach on the alum and wait and see if conditions worsen. Okay, next slide. I'm going to conclude here to talk about our community outreach. Community outreach is probably the most important thing because these plans are ultimately for the lake communities. They're the ones that will need to make changes, and in Snohomish County at least, gather the majority of the funding, although we may be able to help secure grants. So our approach in the next slide was to work strongly with the community leaders, involve the community leaders from the very beginning in helping to develop the plan and promote it with the lake community, and then carefully presenting the plan to the broader community. So at Loma, they have an informal organization, so it was a lot more challenging. There were just some active community members there. And we had a water quality meeting with them, which kicked this all off. They were upset that the aerator was considered illegal. And so we worked with them, and that's how we ended up applying for the grant to develop a plan. To promote the plan, we had an ice cream social. This helps to get people in that might not be involved otherwise. And then at that time, we announced that the plan would be coming out and there would be a water quality meeting. And unfortunately, not many people came to that water quality meeting. Even though there was a lot of interest and a lot of people said, I really want to be there, but can't make it, a lot of people didn't. If you want to click on the animation here, we found that at Loma, we found little interest in moving forward, mostly because a lot of people had never found out about the plan, or there wasn't a strong leadership to figure out what the next step was. In contrast, Sunday Lake has a more formal organization. Sorry, there's a typo there. Over the years, they've brought several attempts to the county to start restoration for anything from floating wetlands to other ideas, and it ultimately led to this plan development. And they were one of the first lakes to embrace Lakewise, got really involved. They helped us host a social event. People got excited about it, and also helped to really promote that this plan was going to be developed. We had a water quality meeting planned, and then COVID hit. So instead, we did an online presentation and survey. However, we found this to be actually more effective. More people showed up to this presentation or watched at their leisure at home, and we did a survey with it. Next slide. And from that survey, we found some real benefits. We really got to hear what each resident felt. At community meetings, sometimes the vocal members can kind of take over the meeting and you don't get to hear from everybody. So we really got to hear their thinking. And surprisingly, even with the high cost, Sunday Lake community leaders, respondents wanted to move forward with the alum treatments, or at least planning for them, which was not even our recommendation. So it was really helpful. So in conclusion, we found the lessons learned that solutions are not always straightforward. We thought with these small lakes, it would be a lot more straightforward, but it wasn't. And those that allowed for adaptive management were the most helpful because it can manage some of that uncertainty in our estimates for things like waterfowl and septics. The online presentation and survey was one of the best mechanisms we found. And we also found that lake communities with more formal structures equal higher likelihood of success. So we might have encouraged that first. And then finally, I just wanted to acknowledge the contributors, the lake volunteers, my coworkers, Tetra Tech, and the Department of Ecology for funding. And now I'm going to questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Marisa. We now have about 6 minutes to do a question and answers. Rob, could you unmute and put your picture up so we have all 3 presenters available? I have some questions that have come in, and I'm going to direct them to you. So first, a question for Shannon. The waterfowl data is very interesting. Can you talk about what data was used to estimate the phosphorus mass in the waterfowl excretions, and what would the forms of nitrogen and phosphorus be?
Yes, so we went and kind of dug through some literature data and used a couple equations from, one of them was actually from a Green Lake study that Harry had done, but it looked at you estimate the weight of the waterfowl droppings, that's based on species, and then there are some literature values for the amount of phosphorus in each of the droppings, and then there was also some factors including like probability of the actual droppings getting into the lake. So there were some assumptions that were made. In terms of the forms of nitrogen and phosphorus, it would be mostly soluble. So if you think about it, and if you've got a bunch of swans on a lake surface doing their thing, all of that waste and droppings would be going directly into the water column and would be mostly soluble. And this had been one of the first years that Snohomish County had done any monitoring during the winter months. So we actually got some really interesting results and some high chlorophyll values in the winter that were a little bit of a surprise. So we're thinking that the soluble phosphorus, some of it probably goes out, but some of it also is probably taken up by algae during the winter months and then settles out into the lake bottom.
Okay, thank you. Another question. And this is again about the waterfowl. What are the discussions around resident waterfowl inputs to the nutrient picture? Obviously, there's regulatory complexities and real world efforts and time needed to deter the birds. This is a real problem all over lower elevation lakes in Washington, especially with the Canada geese.
I think I can probably speak to that one in terms of the community response. So I should mention that the majority of the issue is the swans. There's actually thousands that come in. The average is only 300. And overall, the community loves them. I mean, they're concerned because they poop a lot, but they generally love them and they don't really want to do anything. The geese that are there are more seasonal. They don't have a lot of the resident geese. There's a few, and there has, I think, been issues in the past to do egg adeline and other things when they've been worse. And there is not really a strong issue of waterfowl feeding or other things. But we have been encouraging shoreline restoration, and just in terms of that's what people are frustrated with geese. So that's been the main strategy used, is to have higher vegetation at the lake shorelines. And a couple that's one of the main reasons community members did implement shoreline restoration. It's a strong motivator.
Okay.
That it, hopefully.
So now I have one for Rob, and that is, could you summarize your findings with respect to the nanobubbling technique? Do you have anything more to add?
I don't have much to add. Joy Mashad did that research, and there isn't that much in the literature on the effectiveness, but I would encourage you to attend a session in this conference by Christian Ferentz this afternoon, and he's going to talk all about nanobubblers, so you'll learn more about them probably than I even know here today, I'm sure. But they're a really interesting technology, and we support them principally by the theory that they provide such a higher oxygen transfer rate because of the small bubbles and the surface area to volume thing going on. And they're also very energy efficient, and they just have a lot of promise. They haven't been used that much on small lakes, but I think, I just think they're a really exciting technology, and that's why we recommended them.
I think we have time for one more. And I think this is one that a number of people would be quite interested in. This is a question for Marisa. How does Snohomish County fund the Lakewise program? And can you give an estimate on your budget?
So the Lakewise program, so Snohomish County Surface Water Management is funded through a surface water utility fee. So it's something charged to each property owner as a fee on their tax bill. So we're very fortunate to have sustained funding for that. should really know a budget offhand. I probably don't. It's probably on the order of $70,000 to $80,000 a year across the county. When we've had grant funding, we've definitely done more in terms of incentives for like restoration and other things. But for the core program with site visits and other things, that's my best estimate, but I can provide further information on that. Or if Jen, I think you're on, you want to chime in on that, go ahead. Also, I should mention too, if anybody is interested on the plans, they're on Snohomish County's website, published in the technical appendices on those calculations and that sort of thing. You can check them out.
Okay. Jen, do you have any of that?
I think Marisa is about correct. I think it's on the order of around $80,000 per year, including staff time.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, for those whose questions didn't get answered, I'm sorry. We can figure out which ones were not, and we will convert them to emails to these three participants. Thank you very much. We're now going to go to a break, and we will reconvene at, it looks like 10:20, so you get 10 minutes, and session 2 will be water quality. Thank you very much.